Well, thank you very much for that, Rebecca, and thank you everybody for such a warm welcome. It's a bit of a sort of return for me because I was a very socially active member of the union a long, long time ago, so it's a real pleasure to be back in this chamber. It's also a bit of an anniversary for me as well because I've just remembered the date, the 28th of January, which means that it's actually the 20th anniversary of my first day working for MI5. I have to point out I was a sort of infant prodigy. I was only like 14 when I joined, so... But so it's a bit of a sort of funny date to be doing this talk. Yes, so tonight I've got the luxury of quite a long time, I think, to discuss what it's like to be a spy, but then to sort of move on to some of the bigger political pictures, because of course spies keep cropping up in the news these days. Can I just ask, is anyone brave enough to put their hand up if I say, do any of you want to be spooks? Are you bitten by the intelligence bug? A few, good. Well, I'm not here just to diss them, although I do have a couple of negative things to say, but I think it is important to try and place them within a context, a political and an ethical context, and I hope to be able to do that a bit tonight as well. But yes, just to start off with a bit of the background, what it's like to be there, and also what it's like to leave and blow the whistle, which is what I ended up doing. I was recruited way back in 1990. I didn't actually want to be a spy, strangely enough. I wanted to be a diplomat, quite fancied the sort of swanning around foreign embassies, swilling champagne and things. But they had other plans. I had this letter in the post on Ministry of Defence notepaper saying, we may have other jobs for you that would interest you. And I don't know why, but my very first thought when I saw this letter was, oh my God, it's the spies. It's MI5. And it's a strange sort of gut instinct, but it was right. But of course, I didn't know it was the spies until I got to my very first meeting with them. And I was going to ignore the letter, but unfortunately, my father was in the room when I opened it, and he was an investigative journalist. So you can imagine there was a bit of pressure on me to just try and find out if, in fact, my instinct was right. So ever since then, I can always say that I just blame my father. It was his fault that I ended up being a spy and then a whistleblower. So it's always good to be able to blame the parents. Anyway, I was recruited in 1990, and that was a slightly strange year to be recruited because MI5 had been around, and so had MI6, which is the sort of James Bond intelligence gathering wing of British intelligence. And they'd been around for 80 years at that point. And for 80 years, those 80 years, they'd operated off the legal radar. They did not officially exist. So, for example, if an MP wanted to ask a question about some scandal involving spies or the expenditure of the spies or the work of the spies, they just weren't allowed to because we didn't talk about them in Britain. But there were a series of scandals in the 1980s, whistleblowing and criminal scandals. So, come 89, a piece of legislation was put in place called the Security Service Act, which covers MI5. Of course, MI5's official name is the UK Security Service, which they used to shorten down to UKSS. Some bright spark eventually twigged it didn't have very good historic connotations, but I think they've changed it since. So yes, they were put on a legal footing with the Security Service Act in 1989. And this is sort of crucial to the story because, as I said, I hadn't been interested in being a spy. They had a really bad rep in the 80s for investigating left-wing activists and the miners' strike and things. But at that point they said, well, no, actually, we're portrayed badly in the press. We now have to follow the law because of this new Act of Parliament. And if we want to do something which would otherwise be illegal, for example, go and plant a bug in someone's house or eavesdrop on their telephone or open their post, as was in those days, then we have to get the prior written permission of our political master. And in that case, it's the Home Secretary. MI6 and also the eavesdropping HQ, which is GCHQ, were put on a legal footing 5 years later in 1994. So during my recruitment, I was told, yes, of course, you know, we're all above board now. We're very legal. You know, you don't have to have any ethical qualms. And the recruitment process itself is a sort of foretaste of what it's like to be a spy. It's very long and drawn out, very, very intensive. You have the first interview where you're told it's MI5, actually goes on for like 3 or 4 hours, and they want to know everything about your life from the age of 12. I mean, you know, political views, ethical views, religious views, education, everything. And it's at that point they do say, yes, actually, you know, we are the spooks. And by the way, can you sign a notification of the Official Secrets Act? And from that point, you sort of withdraw a little from your old life because you're told, please, you know, don't spread the word, you're being recruited by us. And you're allowed to tell your parents, perhaps, or your partner, perhaps your best friend, but beyond that, you're not supposed to say what's going on. So you have to withdraw a little bit. And the further you go down that process, the more withdrawn you have to become. Because as you work through the process, of course, you end up being vetted, so your security cleared. And for MI5, that's very hardcore vetting. So they want to talk to 4 of your friends, and then they want 4 of your friends to nominate 4 more each. So they have quite a clear view of you. And of course, at this point, the secrecy aspect goes out of the window. But you can't talk about what's going on yourself. So you end up withdrawing a little bit more and a little bit more from your social circle. And when you end up working there, it becomes much more acute, because once you've got your head around the idea that you're working for MI5, the first few weeks are very, very disconcerting, because you're suddenly dealing with all this strange information that's coming from telephone taps, or from bugs in people's houses, or from undercover agents who are operating within target organizations. Once you get over that sort of cognitive dissonance almost, what you're doing there, and thinking, what the hell am I doing here? Then it becomes very easy to fall into a very sort of inward-looking environment where you can only talk freely and be yourself and talk about your work with your fellow spooks. So you become slightly more insulated from your old life. But it has the potential, so this is where I don't want to put off potential intelligence officers, it does have the potential to be a very valid job, to be a job where you can make a difference and do some good and potentially protect lives. But the major problem culturally within MI5, and certainly MI6, is that they tend to become very inward-looking because of this social insularity. And they tend to become almost like self-perpetuating oligarchies, where dissent is not encouraged, where you're told to just follow orders. They're sort of quasi-military in that structure. And you end up with an environment where, because there's very little ventilation or oversight or criticism, if something begins to go wrong, it can go very wrong very quickly. And I think, for example, the recent scandals where we've seen MI5 and MI6 being investigated for involvement in in torture of terrorist suspects is probably a product of that. Because certainly in the 1990s, they were completely against the use of torture. I mean, they'd seen what had happened in Northern Ireland with internment and enhanced interrogation of the IRA suspects. They knew it didn't work. It was counterproductive. But also for ethical reasons, they abhorred the use of torture. And yet now, it seems that they have become more involved in that. And I think that's down to the insularity of the culture. As I said, you get this sort of self-perpetuating oligarchy, almost a sort of groupthink. So what did I actually do when I was there? What do you do if you're an intelligence officer? That's the key question, of course. Most of the work you do is fairly desk-bound. You are employed to investigate target groups. So first of all, you have to identify those groups. Then you have a range of different techniques with which to investigate those groups. And I've touched on some of them. You obviously have human agents you can run into those organizations to report back, or you can bug people's telephones, or intercept their email, or get the police to go undercover, as we've seen recently in all the news, and you get police reports coming in. So you have this whole range of different ways of gathering information and intelligence about your targets. And then when all this keeps piling in, you then have to wade through it and assess it, and then decide what sort of action to take. Be it stop the investigation because someone's not a threat, or perhaps put surveillance on them because they might be about to do something like plant a bomb, so you want 24-hour coverage, or even to go in and ask the police to arrest them because they take the executive action. So you have to identify the threats, investigate the threats, and then do the analysis and report back to government about what's been going on. Which all sounds good and a noble aim. However, as I said, things can go wrong, and this is where it comes to my personal experience of some of the subject areas that I worked on. And I can talk about it tonight. I'm not breaking the Official Secrets Act, because I have written about it and spoken about it in the past, so it's in the public domain officially. So if there's any undercover police here tonight, don't worry. So I worked there for 6 years, and I worked in 3 different postings. And when you're an intelligence officer, you have this sort of the running of the operations into discrete target areas. Now, when I'd been recruited, I was told that they no longer looked at political targets, because up until the 1980s, one of their primary areas of work had been counter-subversion, which is investigating so-called subversive political groups. In this case, they were looking at things like an old entryist part of the Labour Party, militant tendency, and a whole range of little left-wing extremist groups, most notably the Socialist Workers' Party, and that was my area. I was in that section for a couple of years, and I would say at that point the threat was being toned down. We managed to close down most of the investigation. But crucially, that's the section I was in when I met my ex-partner and ex-whistleblower partner, David Shayler. And we were there in 1992, which was in the run-up to a general election. And in those days, when anyone stood for Parliament as a prospective MP, they had their names cross-checked against MI5's records. And if they had a file, that file was pulled up, and that file was reviewed, and a report was sent in from MI5 to the head of the relevant political party to see if someone would be a threat if they were elected, or a threat if they, God forbid, got into government. So we saw a whole range of very interesting files historically. And of course, at that time, the New Labour project was just a twinkle in Tony Blair's eye. But many, many people, in fact, the vast majority of people who became part of his government in the 1990s and the last decade had MI5 files. And it can be for the most ridiculous ideas, things like someone had sort of written a letter to the Communist Party HQ or something like that. But obviously they were deemed to be dangerous subversives. But I raise this because I think it's a problem in a democracy where you have people in government, in the cabinet, people who are actually the political masters of the spies, but they know that they have files held on them by the spies, and they don't know what is on that file. They're not allowed to see that intelligence. So I think it makes it very easy for a degree of influence to be brought to bear on people in that situation in government. It's very much a problem for our democracy where we have a sort of tail wagging the dog situation. Anyway, so I was in that section for a couple of years, and then I worked in the counter-Irish terrorism section and then counter-international terrorism section. The Irish section at that time was called T Branch. I won't dwell too long on that, but there were a series of mistakes that went ahead where bombs that were put down by the IRA on the UK mainland could and should have been prevented. And there were procedural cock-ups, there were mistakes made, and the bombs went ahead. And in one case, I don't know how many of you have heard of a big bombing in 1993 in Bishopsgate in the city, which was the biggest attack on UK soil at that time, and caused about £350 million worth of insurance payouts, and many people were injured and one person lost their life. And this could have been prevented. The guy who perpetrated the attack should have been arrested 6 months earlier, but there was a mistake in the surveillance and a mistake in the command chain. And there was another case as well where some bombs went off in the northeast of England, which could and should have been prevented. And in this case, the desk officer, the intelligence officer on the operation, was David Shayler, my ex-partner. And he wrote a full report saying, look, there were these problems, procedural issues, it could have been prevented. And this report went out to the cabinet, went out to the government. And when the report was actually sent out, it had been bowdlerised so that all mention of any mistake was taken out. So effectively, MI5 was sort of lying to its political masters. It didn't declare it had made all these mistakes. So it was covering it up. And when David went to challenge this, he was just told to shut up by his senior managers. Don't rock the boat, just shh. So our politicians might think they know what goes on with spy agencies, but they are only told what the spies want them to know. But to move on, for the last couple of years, we worked in G Branch, which is the international terrorism section. That's probably the hot branch now, of course. And it was there that we saw a couple of the really serious issues, including the case that made us quit, the case that made us decide to blow the whistle and go public. The first of those was an attack in London in 1994, where a car bomb was driven up and planted outside the Israeli embassy, and it exploded. Now, fortunately, nobody was seriously injured or killed, but it was a very sophisticated, very major device. And there was a massive investigation, obviously. 2 people were arrested, tried, and convicted of conspiracy to cause that attack, not for actually causing it, because they had cast-iron alibis. These 2 people were 2 Palestinian students who were studying engineering in London. And they were sentenced to 20 years in prison each for conspiracy to cause that explosion. And yet, the senior intelligence officer in MI5, his code number was G91, who had been in charge of the investigation, who'd seen all the evidence around the case and all the intelligence around this case, made a formal report at the end of the investigation. And he said that in his view, another organisation had carried out the attack. In fact, he blamed Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. Now, of course, if you read that on the internet, you think, hey, mad conspiracy theory. But as I said, this was the final official report by the senior investigating officer. And this report was never disclosed. It was never given out during the court case, not shown to the judge even for an assessment. And yet I would have thought that if that report had been put into the court case, there's no way those two innocent Palestinians would have gone to prison for 20 years each. I have heard, I think, one has since just about been released, but they have served years and years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. But the case that made us quit and ended up with me helping to blow the whistle and going on the run around Europe and having to live in exile for years was something that became known as the Gaddafi Plot. And this is in the bad old days of the 1990s, where Colonel Gaddafi was seen as the head of a rogue state, where he had an appalling track record of funding terrorist activity around the planet. He'd been a major funder of the Provisional IRA and had also supported Abu Nidal and many, many other Palestinian groups. And there was a bit of history, obviously, between Gaddafi and the West. There had been a sort of escalation of terror throughout the 80s, starting with the shooting of WPC Yvonne Fletcher from the Libyan embassy in London. And then there'd been a bombing of a disco in Berlin. I think it was called La Belle Discothèque in 1986, which was, it was actually used a lot by US servicemen. So the US were targeted there. And then, of course, we had the bombing of Tripoli, where Colonel Gaddafi's adopted 2-year-old daughter was killed, as well as many other innocent civilians, which was carried out by the Americans, and the planes that carried this out took off from the UK. And in retaliation, then, of course, we had the Lockerbie attack, where Pan Am 103 was blown out of the skies over the town of Lockerbie in 1988. And that was targeting, again, American servicemen flying home from Germany to America. So in this background, we have a situation where MI6 gets involved in supporting and funding a terrorist attack in Libya. And this happened in 1996. The planning started in 1995, where a Libyan military intelligence officer, who was codenamed Tunworth by MI6, walked into the British embassy in Tunis and asked to see the resident spy. It's always very handy that MI6 officers tend to work in embassies, because then it's very easy to find them. Anyway, he said that he had a cunning plan where he had this group, and he described them as a group of ragtag Islamic extremists already in place in Libya, and they wanted to try and effect a coup and assassinate Gaddafi and replace him as the government. Now, with very few checks, MI6 took this man to their hearts. They basically started giving him lots of money in order to support the coup effort so he could buy the equipment to carry it out. And I think over a period of about 6 months, they fed him in the region of $40,000 on 3 or 4 separate occasions. They were shoveling a lot of money at this group. Now, of course, the terminology and the spies at the time was Islamic extremist terrorism, but of course everybody knows that sort of grouping now as Al-Qaeda. But at this time, MI6 is supporting such a group to carry out an illegal assassination attempt against a foreign head of state. And yet at the very same time, MI5 was just getting up to speed with this new potential terrorist threat. So they'd set up a section called G9C in the same year to try and investigate Al-Qaeda or Islamic extremist terrorism. So again, you know, the left hand doesn't really know what the right hand's doing. Anyway, David Shaler was the head of the Libyan section in MI5 at the time and was officially briefed about this plot as it unfolded over those months. And he thought initially, oh, it's just boys' own stuff. You know, the intelligence agencies are always trying to be James Bond and they never really get anything done. But then some reports started coming in early 1996, which indicated that an attack had indeed happened. Gaddafi had been travelling back from a People's Congress back towards Tripoli in a cavalcade of cars, and an explosion had occurred underneath the wrong car. So, of course, Gaddafi's still very much alive, you know, the new best friend of our Western leaders. But innocent people died in the explosion, and innocent people died in the ensuing security shootout. And most crucially, MI6 had done this operation, had backed this operation illegally under UK law. As I mentioned before, they were put on a legal footing for the first time in 1994. And under that act, the Intelligence Services Act, they can indeed commit crimes abroad with immunity from prosecution in Britain, even up to and including conspiracy to murder. So this is the fabled license to kill. It does exist, it's not fiction. And under this, they can do all up to and including murder abroad, provided they get the prior written authorization from their political master, in this case, the Foreign Secretary. Now, they didn't get it for this assassination attempt. So we are looking at a plot that is the results in the deaths of innocent people. It's a heinous crime, it's utterly reckless in a very volatile part of the world, and it's illegal under British law. So at that point, we left, and we resigned and specifically took steps to go public about this crime. That was the case that made us quit. Now, of course, in our country, we have this wonderful piece of law called the 1989 Official Secrets Act, which everyone signs when they become a spy. And it means that you can't say anything ever to anybody about your work. Even if you want to report crime on the part of the spies, you're not allowed to go to anyone apart from the head of your service. And you can imagine how far a complaint like that would get. Even if you go to your MP, that is still technically a crime, although I think it would be an interesting one to test. So we knew that we were risking this. We knew we were risking arrest and imprisonment for blowing the whistle. So we fled the country. We went to the newspapers and then we fled the country. And the story broke in 1997. And at that time, it was a huge story, both in the UK and internationally. And we ended up literally on the run around Europe, trying to stay one step ahead of the spies. And during that time as well, immediately afterwards, the government took out an injunction to gag the whistleblowing against the whole media and against the whistleblower. And we sort of knew they would, and it was part of the strategy that we developed to try and get as much support and drive for an inquiry into these sort of crimes before we'd actually gone public. And we were sort of running around France trying to stay one step ahead of the police and the spies, and heard about the injunction and thought, well, this is pretty good because at least the media now is going to push for an inquiry, this is great. And went to bed quite happy one night in 1997. I woke up the next morning to find ourselves rather abruptly bumped out of the news, probably by the biggest story of the decade. So unfortunately, the whistleblowing had pretty much coincided with the death of Princess Diana in Paris, and there was no real comeback from that in the media. So we sort of found ourselves a bit lost in Europe, not quite knowing what to do. Anyway, we ended up holing up in a farmhouse for a few months. We lived in hiding, undercover, not using cash machines, not having a car, just being really, really careful about anyone knowing where we lived. And in that time, we were pushing to get more coverage and an inquiry into things like the Gaddafi Plot and the Israeli embassy bombing. And the government kept refusing, kept pushing back, saying, we're not going to comment about this, we're not going to discuss it. And eventually, the information we threatened to put out on the very young internet, the sort of nascent internet. And at that point, after about 10 months in hiding, the government moved, and they arrested Shaler, threw him in prison in Paris, and tried to extradite him. Now, in those days, you couldn't be extradited quite as easily as you can be nowadays. I don't know how many of you know that there's a very one-sided extradition act in place between us and the US, where if they want to arrest one of us, they don't even need to present any sort of evidence to get us over to that country to be prosecuted, which is one of the issues that I think hacker Gary McKinnon is now facing, and Julian Assange of WikiLeaks potentially could be facing. So it's much easier now to be extradited. In those days, it was relatively easy to stay safe. If you blow the whistle, you are doing a political act, and the French do not extradite people for political actions. So eventually, he was released, and we had another couple of years in France just trying to push for an inquiry. The government, though, to this day, the governments to this day, have managed to avoid ever having an inquiry into the Gaddafi plot. They've never even taken the evidence about it. They managed to sort of spin their way out of a proper inquiry, despite the fact that the plot was stood up by a special panorama investigation and by people from the US intelligence community and the French intelligence community who were aware of the plot. The government just managed to blank it out, pretty much. Anyway, it all ended in tears, of course. If you blow the whistle, it generally does. And Shaler ended up coming back to the UK voluntarily 10 years ago, being put on trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act, and, of course, being convicted. It was a very strange secrecy trial where he wasn't allowed to say anything in his defence, and he wasn't allowed to freely cross-examine his accusers from MI5, where, in fact, the prosecution was allowed to vet any questions he wanted to ask. And it was interesting as well that after the conviction, the judge, of course, makes a formal ruling, formal judgment at the end of the case. And he said, I accept that what was done was in the public interest. I accept that there was no financial motivation for what happened. And I accept that no agent lives were ever put at risk. And I was sitting in the courtroom, watching the journalists write it all down. And I thought, well, at least, some of the truth will have come out. So it was a bit of a shock to me when I opened up the newspapers the next day and all the headlines said precisely the opposite. Something like Shayla sells agent lives down the river for money. And I was like, hang on, I was in the same room as these guys. Is it just they've got crap shorthand or what? And it's just a sense of living through a sort of alternative reality where the media can be so completely spun like that, that they say the opposite of what is in a formal court paper. It's very strange to actually live through that. Anyway, it sort of all ended in tears, really. A bit of a sad story. But it was interesting to live through those years because out of all of that, it was very strange to see the degree of control that the spies can have over the media with the way they spin things and plant stories. And I'll go into that a little bit later. But also how we can't necessarily rely on the notion of a fair trial, a fair judiciary. Sometimes they can, especially in intelligence cases, steer around those sort of notions. And again, I'll get back to that in a little bit. But also as well, I'd just like to plant in your minds the idea that intelligence agencies do indeed get involved in dirty tricks. Not just the Brits and not just Mossad, all intelligence agencies do. Be it encouraging terrorist organisations, wittingly or unwittingly, to carry out atrocities, or colluding with terrorist groups, as the British have a long history of doing in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This is perfectly standard technique. It's a weapon in their armoury. And I would urge you, every time there is some major terrorist atrocity in the news, to just bear that in the back of your mind and deconstruct what is being said, who might have been involved, who has stood to gain from that terrorist attack. Anyway, that's the sort of personal story. So a little bit of spookery and a little bit of going on the run and a little bit of whistleblowing. What I want to do now, though, is sort of pull out from the personal to look more at the political, because the era I'm talking about, of course, is the 1990s. And despite what I saw going wrong, in a way it was the sort of golden era of ethical spying to a certain extent. Yes, they had a bad history, a bad rep, but at that point they were on a legal footing. And they were standing against issues like torture. They were trying, on the whole, most of them, to follow the rules. Some of them didn't. There's always a few bad apples. But I think now, in the post-9/11 world, where we're seeing this sort of hysterical overreaction about terrorism, where we're seeing this sort of exponential growth of both state and corporate intelligence, and where we're seeing the sort of wholesale erosion of our traditional freedoms and our civil liberties across the West, I think it's interesting to sort of pull back a bit from the personal to the political and have a look at what's really going on, using that sort of experience I've had. A lot of people, I think, are very uncomfortable, particularly in America, I know, with the shredding of their constitution. We don't even have a constitution, a written constitution to shred in this country, so it's slightly more difficult for us. But with things like the Patriot Act, they have lost a lot of their rights and freedoms already. We have also lost a huge number of traditional freedoms in this country. And if we're not careful, and I think people are waking up, if we're not careful and we let too many go, we will end up waking up in some sort of police-controlled state. And I think from my personal experience, it's not something I'd recommend, the idea of living under surveillance at all times. During the whistleblowing years, the idea of not being able to have a private conversation in your own flat because it might be bugged. You don't know, but it probably is. Where, for example, you don't know if you can talk privately on your telephone because, again, that might be bugged. It probably is. And certainly as well, there are cases where some of my old friends, one or two, were turned by the spies. They were persuaded or forced to report back on what we were doing as whistleblowers. So that sort of sense is almost like Stasi-like, under the old East German regime, where they reckon, about a quarter of the population were working as informants to the Stasi police. Just that sense of lack of privacy, because you are deemed to be a threat by the state, is quite a strange one personally to live through. And I just want to sort of have a little look at where we are in terms of sliding towards that potential dystopic future. I think a lot of people get angry now, or have certainly over the last decade, over a whole range of issues. The loss of freedoms and, environment issues and climate change issues and, big corporations. And they throw around a lot of phrases like, police state or fascist or pigs or whatever. But I think that's really just the tactic that is used by our intelligence infrastructure, And when I say that, I don't just mean the spies, I mean all the secret police and the corporate mercenary intelligence agencies and things like that. And we're sort of I think that that's the tactic, but the mentality that we're looking at, if you look at other totalitarian regimes, that is the word. It's the totality of control of a population, not just the policing, but actually, and not just what you do, which is the policing aspect, but as a citizenry, what you think, what information you're allowed to ingest, how your political system runs. Is it fair? Is it open? And I just want to look, I think there are a number of issues that we need to address in assessing how to guard and protect our old democratic rights. So we need to look at how the political system is working, if it is working, the judiciary, the media, the economic sphere, and then, of course, how we are managed as a citizenry, how we are policed. I would suggest that the political system is a bit of a mess, not only MI5 having files on a lot of our government ministers, but also the sort of strange approach they have to the troublemakers, the awkward squad, people like George Galloway or Damien Green. He's not notably an awkward squad person. He's now the immigration minister of the new government. But a couple of years ago, for example, he was encouraging whistleblowing from the Home Office because he wanted leaked information on immigration figures. I don't know how many of you remember his case, but he was arrested by the counter-terrorism police. He was hauled out of his office. His Westminster office was trapped. This is an MP. He was the shadow immigration minister at the time. And his home was ransacked in a counter-terrorism style search. It was ripped apart, all for his encouraging whistleblowing for leaks from the Home Office. George Galloway, of course, has been deported from various other Western democracies because he might want to talk about issues like, peace or something subversive like that. One particular awkward squad person from the Netherlands is a rather unpleasant MP called Geert Wilders. He's quite powerful now. But he was invited by the House of Lords to come to the UK and do a talk and was banned from the UK a couple of years ago. So, if you want to rock the boat a bit, they can crack down on you. But, of course, if you're playing by the system, inside the system, then I think MPs do, on the whole, think they can get away with it. They are almost above the law, in a sense. And I think particularly we've seen that with the unfolding expenses scandal. I mean, I know a couple of MPs have now been convicted and probably facing time in prison. But those very MPs, when their case was first tabled in Horse-Free Magistrates Court, I think it was last year, they went down with their lawyers and they said they did not recognise the right of that court to try them. They only recognised trial by their peers, i.e. other MPs. This is on the record. So they, in a way, can think they are above the law. And, of course, some of them are, because, we've seen Tony Blair sliding around the questions at the Chilcot inquiry, not once but twice now. And yet all the evidence suggests, and many leading QCs, including Mike Mansfield, have gone on the record to say there is prima facie evidence that this guy took us into an illegal war. And based on prima facie evidence, he should at least be investigated and then potentially charged with waging illegal wars. And yet he continues to get away with it. And again, in the Netherlands, a similar position. Their former MP has got away with waging an international war, even though the Supreme Court in the Netherlands has said, yes, it was illegal. So they don't seem to be held to account. They seem to be able to get away with a whole range of different things. And yet, at the same time, they seem to be just rubber stampers as well, where, for example, in the case that took us into the Iraq War, we see them not being in full possession of the facts. Even the cabinet wasn't fully briefed about the case for war, but they still voted for it. I mean, I can't think of a more serious vote that a parliament can take than to take a country into a war. But they just went along with it. They didn't know any better. They were whipped into shape. And again, we see with the notional parliamentary committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee, which is supposed to hold the spies to account. It's always held up as the accountability of the spies. But in fact, they can only investigate finance, administration, and policy of the spies, not operational stuff. I've been lied to repeatedly by both senior policemen and by the spies over the last decade, and they don't really have an idea of what's going on. So on the one hand, there's, say, oh, there's no evidence of involvement in torture. Then the evidence appears. Oh, well, we need to increase the time you can keep a terrorist suspect in a police cell because of all these threats that we've thwarted. This is the former head of the Metropolitan Police said this a couple of years ago and got caught out directly lying. He doubled the threat, perceived threat, and lied to the ISC. And it's only through a leak, a whistleblower, probably within MI6, that he was caught out and had to apologise for misleading the committee. So, they can get away with it. The judiciary, of course, I think we're already in a bit of a Kafkaesque nightmare in this country. Not all of us, but certainly select communities. If you're a young Muslim male, you're at far greater risk now. Over the last decade, you could have been interned on the say-so of junior intelligence officers using secret intelligence, not evidence which you're allowed to see. Even your lawyer would not be allowed to see that evidence because it's so secret. Of course, then that changed into being stuck under the terms of control orders. And now that's been watered down to, I think it's something called TPIMS or something, which sounds rather nice, but actually means Terrorism Prevention Investigation Measures, which is pretty much control orders light. So these are people whose basic civil liberties are being infringed. They are under curfew. Their liberties are severely restricted purely because of the assessment of the intelligence agencies and their interpretation of secret intelligence. And that secret intelligence is effectively telephone intercept material, which is bizarrely not used in courts of law in this country, even though if you have the product of a property bug, you can use that in a court of law, but you can't use the product of a telephone bug. It's just so out of date, it's a hangover from the Cold War. What else have we got? Oh, all the lovelies, like extraordinary rendition, where you could be snatched, kidnapped, and taken away to a black prison and tortured for years. I mean, torture. One case particularly is that of Binyam Mohammed that's going through the courts at the moment, where that happened to him, and he disappeared into, I think it was Morocco prison for 18 months. And on top of all the regular torture, enhanced interrogation techniques, he also went through the horror of having his penis slashed with a razor repeatedly over a number of months. I don't even know what to say after saying that. And this is what our spies are involved in. He has got evidence to show that they were involved in that they were aware of and participating in it, putting questions in to his torture. So there is this Kafkaesque nightmare already in place, but not for most of us at the moment, of course. But, you know, communities do go through this. We've had that with the Irish in the 70s and 80s, and now we're seeing it with the Muslim community now. Then, of course, we have corporations running amok. You know, bankers, I mustn't say banksters. It's a polite chamber. You know, bankrupting countries and then getting billions, trillions of public funds and then still paying out huge bonuses and not being accountable and not submitting to regulation. Where we have lobbyists with enormous powers of persuasion. Well, the US is notorious now. I mean, any big corporation can buy a politician. But again, they have undue influence in this country. And where we also see international megacorporations flouting the will of the people, the laws that are passed in Europe. I mean, for example, Microsoft is a notorious one. As a multiply convicted monopolist in the European courts, I think it had the biggest fine ever, billions of euros, for breaking the monopoly laws across Europe, and they're still doing it because they can get away with it. They're above the law. And of course, then we see the criminalization of people who choose to take umbrage, to take offense at this criminality and this running amok, this working above our governments and our laws. The activists who go out and protest are the very ones who then get infiltrated by undercover cops or private security firms. You know, they're deemed to be people like domestic extremists. Well, that's no legal definition. You can't be illegally investigated and aggressively investigated by spies or by police because you're a domestic extremist. It's no standing under law. So yet again, the spies are running amok outside the law. Then what do you have? You have the media. Well, I don't know how many of you rely more on the internet for your news than you do on the old mainstream media, the old media as I always call it now, but that's pretty much a sort of bottleneck. How many of you want to be journalists, by the way? Because I can really put you off that. Okay. No, I mean, I would recommend, if you haven't, reading a book called Flat Earth News by a very eminent journalist called Nick Davis in this country, who's done some academic research into how the media works. I mean, of course, it's been very centralized. The ownership of media is very centralized, very corporate now. But, in fact, looking at the amount of column inches that journalists have to push out every day, and the amount of available time they have to do it, it's doubled in the last 2 decades. So he now calls it churnalism rather than journalism, just churning it out. And you don't have time to do proper investigations to hold power to account. But also, I mean, we're all aware of, you know, the spin masters, people like Alistair Campbell and the government, the dark arts of spin. But the spies are pretty good at it too. They've been on a charm offensive over the last couple of decades. They induct intelligence and defence journalists to cosy lunches within the HQs of MI5 and MI6 to brief them. They even feed them fake stories sometimes. They have a little section in MI6 called Information Operations, which is shortened down to IOPS. And that has placed fake stories in the media. And once, of course, it's been in one newspaper, it appears across the mainstream media, and it becomes fact. So there was a very notorious case, again, in the 90s, where the son of Gaddafi, Saif al-Islam, wanted to come and study in the UK. And he was a bit of a party boy, and, you know, MI5 and MI6 thought at the time it might be a bit embarrassing to have the son of a rogue head of state living at large in London. So they wanted to create a little fake paper trail in the media. And they picked out a couple of tame journalists on the Sunday Telegraph, showed them some information, the journalists trotted off and duly wrote the story, and it appeared, according to the story, that Saif al-Islam was involved in laundering money, terrorist funds for Iran via Egypt. Now, it was completely fake. And when he sued, of course, there happened to be a tame whistleblower who could back it up. And when the whistleblower went forward and said, actually, you know, this is a load of lies, that's when MI6 and the government, the Sunday Telegraph, they are very similar, when they settled out of court for a rather large sum. The Sunday Telegraph was always known, jokingly, within spook circles as the in-house rag of MI6. They're very close connections. Used to be edited by a man whose brother-in-law was a very senior spook. Anyway, so that's the media. They also have a whole barrage of other laws to control the media. We have the what used to be called the D-Notice Committee, which is a voluntary organisation of senior spies and senior media types who get together and can slap a D-Notice on a story if it might cause embarrassment to the spies. That's self-censorship by senior media people. There's also, of course, the threat of libel laws. The UK is now the libel capital of the world, where people can come in and get huge payoffs, even if like one book that's been rude about them is published or sold in this country. Even counter-terrorism laws have been used against journalists to try and force those journalists to hand over their source information, where they get the information from. That's the sacred cow of journalism. And, of course, journalists, too, can be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act. It's Section 5, and if their story from an intelligence agent causes damage, they can be prosecuted and sent to prison for 2 years. So there's quite a lot of control around mainstream journalism as well. And that leaves, really, the policing side of things. Now, I find this very interesting, because I've been doing these talks now for a few years about the erosion of our civil liberties, both here in Europe and the States. And I have to say, the perspective from other Western countries is that the UK is appalling. It's a real police state in terms of the way its citizens are spied on. Now, I know, you know, we all wander around the streets and don't feel too under pressure most of the time, but if you look at some of the powers that have come in the last decade, it is quite draconian. Although, of course, this week there has been some good news as the government has rolled back some of the provisions to a certain extent. So I suppose people power can still make a difference. But we have the notorious Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000, RIPA, it's always called, the Grim Reaper. And that is one of the laws that has been watered down a little. This was supposed to allow the spooks and the police to intercept our electronic communications. It was supposed to bring the old acts up to date for the internet age. But in fact, what it meant was that many, many public bodies, 800 public bodies in this country, could spy on us. They could use counter-terrorism style legislation to spy on their citizens. I don't know how many of you have followed the decline of RIPA this week, but this basically meant that if your local council, your borough council, wanted to spy on you to check that you actually lived in the address you said you did in order to send your kids to a decent school, they could and did spy on you. They would follow you around, they would look at your telephone records and things. They would use the full force of terrorism laws to try and do that. Now, there has been an outcry about this. There have been a couple of high-profile legal challenges to this. So this is one of the things that has been watered down and was passed this week. It basically means now I think it's more restricted to the spies. But, I mean, they can still do it if they have legal cause, all these local boroughs. CCTV is one thing that always I get asked about outside this country, because the UK is notorious for having so many everywhere. I think the last count was 4.5 million publicly owned CCTV cameras. Oh, by the way, just as a little sideline, I wrote a book in 2005, which, of course, I had to submit to MI5 for clearance, otherwise I go to prison. And they insisted on taking some bits out, sensitive operational techniques. And I thought, well, OK, I'm going to publish this, but have the bits they want out blacked out so people can see I've been censored. And if you can never get your hands on one of the books now, because they're quite out of print, there is a little section of just 4 letters, and they insisted on me taking it out. And this was those letters, CCTV. They thought that that was a sensitive technique that nobody had ever heard of. So that was censored. Anyway, CCTV, 4.5 million publicly owned ones, plus all the private stuff on private property. And they reckon that if you go about your daily business in London, during the period of one day, you'll probably be photographed or filmed 500 times, because they're everywhere. But it gets worse, because not only do we have the usual CCTV cameras, which are being rolled out pretty much everywhere to a certain degree, we have had trialled in this country, in Middlesbrough in the northeast, talking CCTV cameras, where the police watch you live on the street, so the camera can move around and follow you as you walk, and where they can actually bark orders at you. If they see you breaking the law in some way, like, you know, can the lady over there please pick up that wrapper she's just dropped on the pavement, they will tell you to do it. Now, this was a trial, apparently, but I read recently that the government, of course, is trying to water down some of these provisions. So they told Middlesbrough County Council to get rid of these things. And they are fighting a really rearguard action to say, no, we need them to keep our streets safe. So it's an object lesson in you give a bit of power to the authorities, and it's very difficult to wrest it back. But it gets worse. Now, police forces are putting in orders, in fact, I think some already have, airborne drones based on military-style drones that can spy on us from the skies. And I read something a while ago where the CEO of one of the countries that is supplying this to these agencies said, actually, they had actually expressed an interest in weaponizing these things, but I'm not interested in doing that yet. So, these are a bit of a problem because they've already been recorded as little airborne pests that can get in the way of commercial and private aircraft. So they might be dropping like flies out of the sky as they keep bumping into our spy drones. So yes, it's all a bit bleak. What else do we have? Well, we had Section 44 of the Terrorism Act. I don't know if anyone here has ever been stopped by the police and questioned for no reason under Section 40. Yeah, of course. Under Section 44, they don't need to even suspect you might be guilty of a crime. They just will stop you and demand details about you for no good reason. And then if you refuse to give your identifying details to them, they will arrest you. This is being changed, the government currently says, but they're just trying to restrict how it will be targeted against people. They will still have the provisions if necessary. And for example, if there's a major event like the Olympics in London, it'll be a blanket coverage of the old Section 44 style stop and search. So we have a whole range of invidious laws that came in. Oh, another wonderful little one. Are there any lawyers here tonight? Yes. Have you heard of the CCA 2005, Civil Contingency Act? This was a wonderful one. This is still in place. This basically says that any government minister in the cabinet at the stroke of a pen can sign an emergency order for 30 days. It doesn't have to go through Parliament or anything. And under that emergency order, they can quarantine us. This was in the wake of, I think, foot and mouth scare. They can stop us moving freely around our country. They can stop political gatherings. And they can even sequester our homes and demolish them for national security reasons and not then have to pay compensation. So this is a lovely one. Have a look at it. 2005 CCA, Civil Contingency Act. So where to stop? I mean, there's so many different aspects where our civil liberties have been pulled back and damaged. But I do have a little bit of hope because, of course, there has been an outcry about the terms of RIPA. There has been an outcry about things like the Section 44 of the Terrorism Act, and the government at the moment seems to be attempting to water it down. There has been a watering down of control orders, although they are still, I think, illegal and disproportionate in a democracy. So I think, the message is get active and make our concerns heard. Otherwise, they will just keep all these nasty measures in place or perhaps make them even worse. So really, it's a case of the price of liberty is indeed eternal vigilance. We all have to be aware of what's going on and take a stand before we can lose too much more of our liberties in the name of protecting us from this nebulous and unending, faceless terrorism threat, the war on terror. But what can we do as well? Because, the whole notion of the war on terror is so overhyped, and yet the very notion of terrorism per se originates from that of state terrorism, not men huddled in caves or in the back rooms of pubs plotting to do nasty things. We're looking at a state oppressing its citizens. That's where the phrase and notion of terrorism comes from, and that's what we need to fight back against. In fact, Amnesty International did a very good report a couple of years ago looking at what constitutes state terrorism. And their assessment was that if a state is exhibiting some of these following traits, like arbitrary detention, no fair trial, torture, kidnapping, execution, extrajudicial execution or assassination, by that definition, the state is exercising terrorism against its citizens. Now, certainly our spies have dabbled in those areas. If you look at the US, they're there already. They're doing all of that, up to and including CIA drawing up lists of targets to assassinate because they are terrorists. Even American citizens who are wanted for terrorism can be assassinated abroad now, at the diktat of the president. But there is hope. One of the things that gave me hope last year was watching how WikiLeaks, the issue of WikiLeaks, took off. Starting with their film Collateral Murder in the spring of last year, where they showed, well, they decrypted and then showed the shoot-up by an Apache helicopter of some Iraqi citizens, including 2 children and 2 Reuters journalists, which had been covered up and lied about for years by the Pentagon. And WikiLeaks got their hands on this video, they decrypted it, and they spread it everywhere. So the Pentagon, for years, have been saying, no, we know nothing about it, we know nothing about any children, we're not going to help the Reuters families come to terms with what happened to their relatives, we know nothing. And then a whistleblower leaks it, and it's put out by WikiLeaks. And I think hackers and geeks and the techno community, the hacktivist community, have so much to offer to our preservation of our liberties, our civil liberties, because as we move more and more into this sort of electronic police state, as we move into this sort of paranoid war on terror mentality, siege mentality, where we are having our information hoovered up on a daily basis, we can find ways around these sort of security bottlenecks just to protect our good old right to privacy, for example. And I think that there is a sort of element that there can be cross-pollination between other activist groups and communities and the hacker communities to offer basic protection and to help us. And I think, speaking as a whistleblower, I just wish that an organisation like WikiLeaks had existed a decade earlier. So rather than having to go through the mainstream media and go to prison and get arrested and all that sort of thing, we could just have put the information on WikiLeaks and it would have had just that sort of impact. It would have been fantastic. So I think there is hope, but I would encourage all of you, please, deconstruct what you read in the mainstream media, get your information from other sources, get active as well, because it's apathy, it's passivity, it's not caring that allows those in authority to take more and more of our rights away. So I just want to finish, you'll be relieved to know, with a modern update on a very famous poem written by Martin Niemöller, Pastor Niemöller, who was a victim of the Nazis in the Second World War, died in a concentration camp, I think. And my modern update on this would be, first they came for the Irish, but I was not Irish, so I did not speak up. Then they came for the Muslims, but I was not Muslim, so I did not speak up. Then they came for the domestic extremists, but I was not an activist, so I did not speak up. When they came for me, there was nobody left to come speak up for me. Thank you very much.